The Satyricon. Dinner with Trimalchio. The third day had already arrived, and that meant the prospect of a free meal. But we were so tattered and bruised, we felt more like running away than resting. While we morosely pondered how to avoid the coming storm, one of Agamemnon's slaves interrupted us. Agamemnon. What's wrong? Don't you know who your host is today? It's Trimalchio, a most elegant man. He has a water clock in his dining room and a trumpeter on call to announce the time, so that he knows at any moment how much of life he's already lost. We promptly forgot all our troubles, dressed up, and asked Giton, who so willingly played the servant's role, to accompany us to the baths. While we wandered the grounds in our evening clothes, or rather joked around and mingled with groups of guests playing games, we suddenly encountered a bald old man in a blood-red tunic, playing ball with some long-haired boys. It was not so much the boys who caught our attention, although they were well worth it, as the paterfamilias himself. He stood there in his slippers, playing intently with a leek green ball. If the ball hit the ground, he didn't chase it, but had a slave with a bag full of balls give the players a new one. We noticed some other novelties. There were two eunuchs stationed at different points in a circle. One was holding a silver chamber pot, the other was counting the balls. Not those batted back and forth by the players, but only those that fell on the ground. While we wondered at the extravagance of all this, Menelaus ran up and said, "This is the guy who's throwing the party. What you see is only the prelude to dinner." As Menelaus spoke, Trimalchio snapped his fingers as a signal to the eunuch to hold out the chamber pot for him as he continued to play. After emptying his bladder, he called for water for his hands, sprinkled it lightly on his fingers, and then wiped them dry on the head of a young slave. There wasn't time to take it all in, so we entered the baths, and the minute we began to sweat, moved on to the cold pool. Trimalchio was already drenched in perfume and being toweled down, not with linen, but with Greek comforters of the softest wool. Right in front of him, three masseurs were guzzling a fine Falernian wine. When they proceeded to spill most of it in a scuffle, he blithely observed that this was a libation in his honor. He was then wrapped in a scarlet cloak and placed upon a litter. 4 runners bristling with decorations pranced before him, along with a little wagon on which his darling was riding. A boy past his prime, puffy-eyed, and even uglier than his master. As Trimalchio was being carried out, a musician holding a tiny flute ran up to his side, and just as if he were whispering a secret in his ear, played for him the whole way. Utterly astonished, we made our way to the door with Agamemnon. By the entrance, we saw a notice posted. Any slave who leaves the premises without permission of the master will receive 100 lashes. Just inside stood a doorman, dressed entirely in green except for a cherry-red belt around his waist. He was shucking peas into a silver dish. Over the doorsill hung a golden cage from which a motley colored magpie called salutations to the guests. While I stared in stupefaction at all of this, I almost fell over backwards and broke a leg. For just to the left of the entrance, not far from the porter's ledge, was the most enormous dog, tethered by a chain. Painted on the wall under some large block letters that said, "Beware of dog." My companions laughed at my fright, but I pulled myself together to look at the rest of the wall. It depicted a slave market complete with price tags. Trimalchio himself was in the picture. His hair is long, and in his hand he grips the wand of Mercury. Minerva leads the way as our hero enters Rome. A painstaking artist has carefully portrayed the whole course of his career, complete with captions. How he first learned to keep the books and then was put in charge of the cash. In the last scene of the fresco, Mercury lifts him up by the chin to a lofty dais. Dais? Dunno. Fortuna is at his side carrying her burgeoning cornucopia as the three fates spin the golden threads. I also noticed a team of runners in the nearby colonnade exercising with their trainer. In the corner stood an imposing cabinet. Inside, I saw a little shrine containing the household gods, sculpted in silver, a marble statuette of Venus, and a none too small golden casket, which, they said, preserved the master's first beard. I started to ask the steward what they had painted in the atrium. "The Iliad and the Odyssey," he said, "and the gladiator show put on by Laenus." It was too much to contemplate. We had already reached the dining room. In the entryway, a bookkeeper was poring over the accounts. But what caught my eye were the rods and axes fixed on the doorposts. They were mounted on top of what looked like the bronze prow of a ship that bore the inscription, "Presented to C. Pompeius Trimalchio, priest of the College of Augustus, by Cinemus the steward." Beneath this description was a double lamp suspended from the ceiling and two wooden tablets, one on each doorpost. I seem to remember that one of them read, "Our Gaius is dining out on the 30th and 31st of December." On the other were painted the phases of the moon and images of the 7 planets, and lucky and unlucky days were marked with studs of different colors. When we had enough of these diversions and were ready to enter the dining room, a slave, evidently assigned to this job, shouted, "Right foot first!" We were momentarily taken aback for fear one of us should commit some faux pas as he entered the room. But just as we moved our right feet forward in unison, a slave stripped for flogging threw himself at our feet and begged us to save him. He was only guilty of a minor offense, it seemed. The bookkeeper's clothes had been stolen from him at the baths. They were only worth a pittance. We drew back our right feet and begged a pardon from the bookkeeper as he sat there counting gold pieces in the hallway. He looked up like royalty and said, "It is not the financial loss that irks me, but the sheer negligence of this worthless slave. He lost my dress clothes, a birthday present from a client, dyed, of course, in the finest Tyrian purple. Admittedly, they had only been washed once. Well, what can I say? You can have him." Grateful for the bookkeeper's munificence, we now entered the dining room. Then the slave we had just saved ran up and, before we knew what had hit us, smothered us in kisses and thanked us effusively for our kindness. "Listen," he said. "You'll see in a minute who it is you've befriended. The master's wine, courtesy of your waiter." At last we took our places. Some Alexandrian slave boys poured melted snow over our hands, while others tended our feet, meticulously paring our hangnails. Not even this distasteful task was done in silence. They kept singing as they worked. I wanted to find out whether the entire household sang, so I ordered a drink. A most attentive slave promptly responded in a grating soprano. In fact, every request was answered in song. You would have thought you were in a pantomime, not a formal dining room. Nonetheless, they served great antipasto. Everyone was now in their place except for Trimalchio, who, following the current fashion, had reserved the most prominent seat for himself. On the hors d'oeuvres tray stood a donkey of Corinthian bronze, bearing saddlebags stuffed with olives, white in one side, black in the other. 2 platters flanked the animal. Their weight in silver and Trimalchio's name were engraved along the edges. Little bridges welded to the plate supported dormice sprinkled with honey and poppy seeds. There were even sausages sizzling on a silver gridiron, which arched over some Syrian plums and pomegranate seeds. We were in the midst of these delicacies when Trimalchio was carried in to a fanfare of trumpets and placed amid a veritable fortress of cushions, a sight that elicited some indiscreet laughter from the guests. For his shaven head poked out of a scarlet shawl, and round his muffled neck he had tucked a napkin bearing a stripe of senatorial purple and a fringe of tassels that dangled here and there. On the smallest finger of his left hand he wore a huge gilded ring. On the very last joint of the next finger he wore a smaller ring that appeared to be pure gold, but it was actually studded with little iron stars. But his display of wealth didn't stop there. He exposed his right biceps, which was adorned with a golden armlet and a bangle of ivory fastened by a bright metal clasp. After picking his teeth with a silver toothpick, he began. Friends, I wasn't really in the mood to come out to dinner yet, but rather than keep you waiting, I have denied myself every pleasure. At least allow me to finish my game. A slave followed with a board of terebinth and a pair of crystal dice. Then I noticed the most extravagant touch yet. Instead of the usual white and black counting stones, he had substituted coins of gold and silver. While he chattered away over his game and we tasted the hors d'oeuvres, a tray was served with a basket on it. There sat a wooden hen, with her wings spread out in a circle, just as they do when they're hatching eggs. 2 slaves immediately came up, and as the music blared on, began to search through the straw. Peahen's eggs were found and promptly distributed to the guests. Friends, I had peahen's eggs placed under the chicken, but to tell the truth, I'm afraid they may have already been fertilized. Let's try them and see if they can still be sucked. We picked up our spoons, weighing no less than ½ pound each, and poked at the eggs, which were encased in a fine pastry. I was about to throw mine away, because it already seemed to have a chick inside it. Then I overheard a more experienced guest remark, "I'll bet there's something good in here." So I pushed my finger through the shell and found the fattest little fig pecker marinated in peppered egg yolk. Since his game was now interrupted, Trimalchio had ordered all the same dishes for himself and announced in a loud voice that whoever wanted a second glass of aperitif could have one. Aperitif? Then suddenly, a musical cue was given, and all at once, our hors d'oeuvres were whisked away by a chorus of singing slaves. Amid all the commotion, one of the dishes was accidentally dropped, and a slave retrieved it from the floor. Trimalchio noticed this, and had the servant's ears boxed, and ordered him to throw the dish back on the floor. A house slave appeared and began to sweep up the silverware, along with the rest of the mess. Then 2 long-haired Ethiopians came in holding little wineskins, like those used to dampen the sand at the amphitheater, and they poured wine over our hands. No one even offered water. When complimented on his elegant service, Trimalchio replied, "Mars loves a level playing field. So I've had each guest assigned his own table. And that way the bustle of these smelly slaves won't bother us so." Carefully sealed wine bottles were promptly served. Attached to their necks were labels. Falernian wine, bottled in the consulship of Opimius, 100 years old. While we were studying the labels, Trimalchio clapped his hands together and cried, "How sad! Even a bottle of wine outlives a mere man. So let's wet our whistles, friends. Wine is life, and this wine's real Opimian. I didn't serve anything this good yesterday, and the guests were much classier." We were drinking the wine and thoroughly relishing all the luxuries of the feast when a slave brought in a silver skeleton, so loosely jointed that its limbs swiveled in every direction. He promptly threw it down on the table several times. Each time its floppy limbs fell in a different pattern. Trimalchio responded in verse. "Alas, poor us! We all add up to squat once Hades gets his hooks in. That's the lot. So live while it's your turn, 'cause then it's not." Our applause was followed by a dish that was disappointingly small, but so odd it had everyone staring at it. On a round serving tray, the 12 signs of the zodiac were arranged in a circle. Over each sign, the specialty chef had placed the kind of food that fit its character. Over Aries the ram, a ramifying pea. Over Taurus the bull, a slice of rump roast. Over Gemini the twins, testicles and kidneys. On the crab, a crown of flowers. Over the lion, a virile African fig. On Virgo, the womb of a barren sow. Over Libra, a set of scales with a cheese tart on one side, balanced by a pancake on the other. On Scorpio, the scorpion fish. On Sagittarius, a seahorse. On Capricorn, a lobster. On Aquarius, a goose. And on Pisces, a pair of snapper. In the middle of all of this was a piece of turf, torn out, roots and all, with a honeycomb sitting on it. An Egyptian slave boy was bringing bread around in a silver chafing dish, while the master himself belted out a tune from the mime, the North African quack, in a hideous voice. We were looking gloomily at this vile fare when Trimalchio piped up. "Please, let's eat. This is just a preamble to our dinner." As he spoke, 4 male dancers bounced up in time to the music and snatched the lid off the next dish. Inside we saw some fowl and sow's udders, and a hare adorned with wings to look like Pegasus. At the corners of the dish we noticed 4 little stones of Marsyas the satyr. From their wineskins, a pepper sauce poured over fish that looked as if they were swimming in a little canal. We all joined the applause, started by the slaves. and, grinning broadly, proceeded to attack the choicest items. And Trimalchio, no less amused by such tricks, called out, "Carver!" A butcher instantly appeared, and, waving his arms to the beat of the music, sliced up the meat. You would have thought of a charioteer fighting to the sound of a water organ. Trimalchio kept egging him on, muttering under his breath, "Carver! Carver!" Suspecting that some joke was being played, I wasn't embarrassed to ask the man next to me what he thought. An old hand at these games, he said, "You see that guy who's carving the fish up? His name is Carver." So every time Trimalchio says the word Carver, he's calling both his name and giving him orders. That's 10 pages. The book is 60 pages, so I think 10 at a time is fine. See you in the next one.